So I thought we'd do a couple things tonight. I thought I would go over two of the chapters, one on psychomotor therapy and one on uh, neurofeedback. And then I'd like it if you would just share a little bit about some of the things you discovered in your paper with your classmates, so they could hear some of the things you found out informally from your seats. Yeah, just whatever you'd like to share about something you discovered or learned in your paper. Whatever you'd like to share. So nothing long or in depth or formal. You can think about that while we're going over these chapters. So I thought the psychomotor therapy was pretty interesting. It reminded me a lot of Virginia Satir from Family Systems Therapy. So one of the things Virginia Satir did quite a bit was family sculptures. And she could do that a number of different ways, but many times she would actually pose members of the family to be in positions that illustrated or demonstrated a feeling. So let's say you have a child, parents started to argue, one of them might have been drunk or violent, and so Satir would ask the child to arrange one parent, and you could manipulate the arms, explain the facial expressions, and perhaps the child would put a hand or a fist in the air and a mean face. And then the child would arrange the spouse, and perhaps the spouse would have a hand up for protection and a frightened face. And then she would ask the child, what would you be doing? And the child might go someplace in the room and pretend like they're hiding. And this did a number of things. It allowed everybody in the family, being in a group in a calm environment where everybody's sober and hopefully tempers are cooled, to re-experience the emotions that other family members had experienced during that turmoil, and it would create empathy in the other family members, hopefully. It also provided an outlet for to express the emotions, because sometimes people feel unheard, or as the chapter would say, unseen, when they would try to talk with another family member, or perhaps they were so frightened they wouldn't even bring it up. So that was the first part of family sculpting. And then after Virginia Satir was very into accurate communication and empathy. So after talking about things and expressing emotions and processing those emotions, and then they would resculpt the family the way they would like it to be. So, the violent or addicted spouse would have a totally different position in the group, family group, which would be a circle, and have a different expression and a different physical body stance. And hopefully the other spouse would be calm and not frightened. And the child would place themselves usually in between the two parents in a non-threatened stance, hopefully a more loving resculpturing of the family dynamic and the people within the family. So that's what that all occurred a long time ago, before psychomotor therapy. But that's what it reminds me of. And as the author talks about psychomotor therapy, I think it incorporates everything I have just shared about satir, but there's another dimensionality of this, and that's kind of a mixture of imagining people during the time of the client's life that the client experienced trauma. So imagining people as the individuals who were either victims or abusers or whatever the trauma was. And they could step in. They also have what's called a witness, which allows the client to be heard and is basically reflecting what is happening. But they call it being a witness. Really, it's Rogerian reflection. The other aspect is that it's three-dimensional, so it's in a three-dimensional space. It's not just talking or writing about it or something like that. And it's not replacing memories, but it's allowing for possible alternatives, or I would call it wishful thinking. So they're not exactly sure how this works. However, it does seem to reactivate the amygdala and other parts of the brain that have kind of shut down or become frozen in the fight or flight response. So I think I just want to highlight a couple things. So they call this chapter Filling in the Holes, and it begins with, it's one thing to process memories of trauma. It's an entirely different matter to confront the inner void, the holes in the soul that result from not having been wanted, not having been seen, not having been allowed to speak the truth. If your parents' faces never lit up when they looked at you, it's hard to know what it feels like to be loved and cherished. If you come from an incomprehensible world filled with secrecy and fear, it's almost impossible to find the words to express what you have endured. If you grew up unwanted and ignored, it's a major challenge to develop a visceral sense of agency and self-worth. I think this also reminds me a lot of Rogerian conditional versus unconditional love and positive regard, of active listening and a sense of being heard and seen. So I think a lot of things go into this. I just think this type of creating structures or psychomotor therapy kind of incorporates all of those things I mentioned and takes it to another level, probably the best possible level that they've thought of so far. And there is this sequence to the therapy where they do the client, the volunteer or the client, first picks a support who often becomes the witness. Somebody, they usually don't know the individuals, but somebody who looks like maybe they feel safe with. And so that's their support, that's their witness who interprets what is happening and reflects that back to the client. They do this in two ways. The first way is by expressing what is happening with the person who's acting like the father, the person who's acting like the mother, person who's acting like a bully or a sibling or whatever it might be. So they'll interpret that and reflect that to the client, but it's more important to reflect the client's reaction to the actor. And they reflect the response in two ways. They can reflect body language, which is they call it micro, a very small physical responses to what's being said or seen, or by reflecting if the client feels moved to talk about or express their emotions or reactions to what's happening, then they'll reflect and summarize or paraphrase that. Always helping the client to be seen and heard. Sometimes once the reflection is shared, and the client will have another reaction to being heard, and then that is also reflected. So it's a multi-layered, multi-dimensional process. After they process the negative family or situation surrounding the abuse or trauma, then they substitute what they would call, rather than the real father, they would substitute the ideal father, or the real mom, they would substitute the ideal mom. They might even substitute the client. So, and then they would go through that same process again. But that would provide an imaginary alternative. It also provides the client with kind of what really should have happened. And the book doesn't really talk about this, but that dynamic of the client realizing this is what my life should have been like with these individuals, rather than what it was actually like, this alternative, that takes any self-blame, guilt, shame, condemnation, self-criticism, and lifts that from the client, because they do realize that it wasn't me. I should have had this alternative life. I deserved love, acceptance, being heard, unconditional positive regard. So I think through them being a part of this process, this they call it psychomotor, it's like acting almost, that it makes these thoughts more real, these realizations, and then they actually incorporate the new awareness that is facilitated through this process. So it begins to restructure these inner maps. It says a neuroimaging study has shown that when people hear a statement that mirrors their inner state, this is the reflection that I'm talking about, the right amygdala momentarily lights up, as if to underline the accuracy of the reflection. And this whole process is basically an affirmation of the client. The rescripting part reminds me of narrative therapy. So if we're, rescripting our own lives, that's the whole point of narrative therapy, taking control of our story. And even though we can't change the past, we are in control of how we react to it, how we act in the present, how we interact with other humans in our lives. And so I think when they're talking about rescripting, it's kind of interesting how eventually all of these theories, they're all unique in some way, but often bits and pieces become integrated into larger theoretical models. As you read the chapter, does anybody have any comments or questions about this? Well, let's talk about neurofeedback. I have an interesting story. So back in the early 90s, I was working in my internship. My internship was like a 2-year internship. It was kind of a paid internship for 2 years where I would work at a school for kids who lived at the school. And it's called Scotland School for Veterans Children. But at one point, they had received a grant and they used the money to buy, at that time, they didn't call it neurofeedback, they called it biofeedback machines. But it's the same concept, but it only measured alpha waves. It didn't measure all of the different types of waves. And so what we did was we would, if children were having problems with anxiety or anger or something like that, we would put the electrodes on a band that went around their head. They would have, I think there were 2 on their temples, and we would put mechanism on their finger to measure their heartbeat, and their pulse, which is the heartbeat. And there was one, and then we had one that measured body temperature as well, so temperature. So on the machine, there was a green light and a red light. Green meant relaxed, red meant tense. And we tried to figure out what worked best for the individual. We had a lot of different methods that we could use, and different individuals respond to different things. So we could use different kinds of music to see if they responded to music. We would use relaxation, stress inoculation, breathing, muscle relaxation, guided imagery. So we would use a lot of different things. We would ask them if they did anything that was relaxing. Like one of them said they liked drawing or doodling. And we would follow through with a combination of these things, and they could either sit with their eyes closed and we'd tell them when the light turned green and encourage them to continue whatever they were doing with their bodies and minds. We wanted to see 3 things happen. We wanted to see brain waves go into alpha so that they would be mentally or cognitively relaxed. We wanted so the light on the machine would turn green. We wanted their heartbeat to lower by at least 10 beats per minute. And we wanted their body temperature to go down. And there was a fairly stable temperature in that office. And we had some pretty good success with that. We didn't do it to deal with trauma or anything like that. All we wanted to do was help the kids figure out how to relax themselves so that it would either help them with their anxiety or their anger. So that was our goal then. So that was back in like 1990. And then when I met my wife and I started visiting her family. So she had a brother and a sister and her, and they were all adults when I met them. So when we would visit their mom, she would always have a game to play or a movie to watch, and then we'd eat. And one Christmas, she bought a game. I forget what it was called. Maybe you've played it, but it had a picture of like a brain, like brain power or something like that. Cranium, that's it. That's it. And cranium. And so, two people would sit in front of each other and they'd both put the headband on with the electrodes, and you'd be able to move what those wires were connected to, either back or forward. And if it crossed a certain line, you won. So if you moved it so far using the electrodes, using your brain, you won. And so I knew what was going on because, I had done that with the kids when I was a intern for the school counseling. And so my wife's brother is like a huge guy, like a football player kind of guy. And he's sitting across from me wearing his headband. He's thinking so hard, I thought he might have to use the restroom. And like he's trying really hard. And I'm doing everything, to just relax. And all of a sudden, the little object, what is it that we move on the board?
I don't see how it
Is that how old I am? All right, so yeah, so it just starts smoothly moving towards him, and he's trying harder and harder. And then we do the same thing to the sister, and so I know how to win this game. And I keep saying, well, you're just not trying hard enough, you're just not thinking hard enough, anything to stress them out a little bit. But yeah, it was fun. And I told him how to actually win before I left. And but there is a large movement, not only with trauma, but with all kinds of things and neurofeedback. And now they have much more complex machines. It's not you don't even need that much anymore. You can run everything into a personal computer now. You don't have to buy like a dedicated neurofeedback machine. I mean, they have them, they're very expensive, but now you can get one just for whatever home computer you use. And what they're realizing basically is, by training our brain to get into kind of, we used to call it the alpha mode, or the relaxed state, it trains the brain to leave that fight or flight response. So and you can train it. So something's the program his colleague used was very similar. On the computer screen, you would see two different colored race cars, a green one and a red one. And the more you relaxed, the green one would start to win the race. So that was the payoff, the reward. So as you're training your brain, you're getting that video game reward of winning the video game. You're also getting a physical and cognitive payoff of being relaxed, which is probably the best payoff. And so what they've noticed with the trauma is that, the alpha state would actually reaccess or reanimate parts of the brain that were not functioning as well due to the trauma. So, it says, in effect, she told me we may be freeing up innate but stuck oscillatory properties in the brain and allowing new ones to develop. So they've seen a lot of progress with this. I know they used it for a lot of different things. There's some nice illustrations in this chapter if you're interested. All the different types of brain waves and using an EEG and what the different types of brain waves mean. So like alpha is relaxation, theta is that time in between relaxation and sleep. It's kind of like that twilight. And delta is sleeping. SMR is pretty interesting because it's relaxed thought. They've done a lot of studies like on meditation and kind of creative thinking, like when an artist is creating. And it's usually in that SMR range. It's relaxed thought. But sometimes you can be in beta, but that's more active processing, more active cognitive processing. Then they have high beta, which is excited. So SMR or beta are really like where you want to be if you want to be creative or working or solving a problem or something like that. Alpha is relaxed. And so far, they've really only worked at training our minds to be relaxed and, the alpha state. But I'm wondering, how would we use neurofeedback to train for those other states if we wanted to access SMR for more creativity or meditation, if we wanted to access the beta for more kind of working and problem solving? How would we train our brains to access those other states? So I think, it's been around for a long time, but we're really just beginning this process of neurofeedback. I'm wondering if any of you have ever experienced neurofeedback in any way other than cranium.
I never experienced it, but I remember studying that in high school and then just hearing about it a lot from because I've always been interested in psychology, but all that stuff seemed so, well, it seems archaic now because this was way back in the day, but
Yeah, and you had to buy the machines and they were very
expensive, big huge
and
machines,
everything else, but now it's accessible. I'm guessing eventually, they might already have it, but they'll probably have an app for the phone and you can plug some electrodes into the USB port and go to town.
Yeah, and I think too that I've seen the EMDR at the site that I'm at right now, and it's fascinating. She used something where they held something in each hand and then she had to shut her eyes and then she would beep each hand, I guess, and it was very, very interesting. And the client actually looked visibly different. She was pale as a sheet before she did it, and after, all her color came back in her face. Her anxiety level was way, way down. And to me, that was really solid proof that stuff like that works.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Probably more so than just talking.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the real thing is like when you get that combination, you know, like so many people are just on medication. But even with medication, I think you've got to have medication and some type of therapy.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that too. And I worked at the VA for so long, the same thing. You had drugged out veterans who didn't really participate in their recovery, or, they just wanted their next medicine cup. And but the ones that came to the art therapy classes, can't call it art therapy, sorry. The art lessons that I gave actually worked hard to recover mentally and soul wise, and they would talk to each other, and it was pretty interesting to watch the difference between those who really wanted recovery and really wanted to get well, and those who thought drugs were the miracle.
Yeah. Thanks. All right, so I'm going to stop recording and then we're going to just share papers or whatever you'd like to share.